Hi everyone, my name's Martha. I recently completed a PhD in history at the University of Birmingham. My thesis was a queer oral history of bisexuality and multiple gender attraction in 1970s and 1980s Britain. I interviewed 17 people in total, most of whom identified as bisexual, and some who didn't identify as bisexual but had experienced attraction to multiple genders across their lifetimes. The interviews were life history interviews, which meant that I encouraged the interviewees to reflect on their whole lives, and then I asked kind of follow-up questions as we went along. I didn't have a specific list of questions to ask, but rather some kind of general topics that I was particularly interested in. So identity, relationships, community, politics, and popular culture. So just to introduce queer oral history, if any of you don't know about it, it's a form of oral history that's influenced by queer theory and queer critical history. So as well as exploring various aspects of the interaction and relationship between the interviewer and the interviewee, queer oral history asks how that relationship is affected if both parties are or are believed to be queer or LGBT. Although not all oral historians of LGBTQ issues will themselves be LGBTQ, most writing on oral history methodology assumes that that will be the case and then proceeds on that basis. So in this paper, I'll attempt to show why I think that queer oral history is a particularly useful methodology for studying bisexuality and multiple gender attraction in the past, and also demonstrate the ways in which attention to bisexuality and multiple gender attraction might help to inform, build on, and complicate a queer oral history methodology. There are three aspects of queer oral history that I want to explore. These are visibility, community, and language. Firstly, visibility. As I mentioned before, a theme in many queer oral histories is the sexual sameness between the interviewer and the interviewee, the idea that they are both insiders in a perceived community of usually gay men or lesbians. Nanala Miller-Boyd and Horacio Enroque Ramirez argue that the intimacy that this sexual sameness creates is rooted in the body, in visual cues relating to physical appearance, which they call sexual embodiment and body-based knowing. The queer oral historian Amy Tooth Murphy has spoken, for example, about the sexual sameness between herself as a lesbian interviewer and her older lesbian interviewees. She acknowledged that her interviewee's awareness of this sexual sameness was aided by the fact that she, quote, looked like a lesbian. In her case, that meant having short hair and wearing masculine clothing. When reading or listening to these discussions, I reflect on my own appearance, which has changed over time, and the signals that it might send. I've always dressed in a relatively feminine way. I used to have much shorter hair, but it's now a fairly nondescript length. And I'm conscious, therefore, of the fact that I very frequently pass as a straight woman. After our interview had taken place, one of my interviewees asked me whether I had come out as bisexual, and she spoke about how straight people might think they have the right to research and comment on sexual minorities in a way that suggested she didn't approve of that. The oral historian Jessica Rees has also talked about how some second-wave feminists she interviewed asked her whether she was a lesbian before they would consent to being interviewed. Although in my case, the question came after the interview had ended, so I wonder how much of the interview itself was affected by the interviewee's uncertainty about my sexuality. So what's the significance of bisexuality and multiple gender attraction in particular in relation to this? After all, bisexuals aren't the only people to pass as straight. Much of the literature about passing in the context of sexuality has been written by femme lesbians, and Rees's interviewees, for example, were concerned about whether she was a lesbian specifically. However, I would argue that the notion of passing and visibility is particularly complex in relation to bisexuality. This is because there are almost no clear ways of making one's bisexuality visible to an onlooker. If you are monogamous, the gender of your partner cannot demonstrate that you are bisexual. There are also no clear ways of demonstrating bisexuality through style choices. The bisexual theorist and activist Shuri Eisner states that bisexuality is not known to have any visual markers, and therefore bisexuals are routinely accused of fraudulence, perceived as invisible, and forced to deal with others' doubts. There are therefore no clear embodied or gendered visual markers I can give to interviewees to suggest sexual sameness. There's no clear way I can demonstrate myself to be bisexual without actually saying so. Bisexuality therefore increases uncertainty and complexity in the interview context in a way that develops some of those analyses of sexual sameness that are present in existing queer oral histories. Secondly, I want to touch on the idea of community. The discussions of visibility focus on making visible one's insider or outsider status in relation to an assumed community. Most queer oral histories question and problematize that idea of community. But I'd argue that a focus on bisexual history in particular enables us to build upon some of those analyses of community and what it means. Claire Hemmings argues that bisexual partiality is formed in relation to communities that do not recognize bisexuality as discrete or viable. That is, in relation to communities of people who are not bisexual and do not accept bisexuality. For some interviewees, that lack of community continued for them into the 21st century. So Louise was ambivalent about the bi community when she came out in the early 2000s, remembering that my interactions with the bi community were kind of a bit unsatisfying, really. Everything felt really homemade. It felt very new. It felt like people were still kind of ironing out the nitty gritty. It didn't feel like there was like a shared understanding or a culture, like everything was still being chewed over. Another interviewee, Curtis, questioned whether there was a bisexual community, even at the time of our interview in 2018, saying, "I don't think there is a bisexual community. I haven't discovered one." Of my 17 interviewees, 10 were not part of any bisexual or LGBTQ groups at the time of our interview. Of those who were, 4 regularly attended meetings of groups specific to bisexuals, while 3 others discussed being part of general LGBTQ groups. Given that much of my early recruitment was through bisexual groups, this is a surprisingly small number. The lack of a coherent community complicates that idea of sexual sameness I discussed before, as the divide between an insider and an outsider is much less distinct. As Louise put it, you can have somebody saying they're bisexual and someone else saying they're bisexual, and the way their sexuality is expressed is completely different, especially with bisexual people. And again, that's not exclusive to bisexuals. John Howard discusses similar problems with finding men who engage in homosexual activity or gender nonconformity but do not necessarily identify as gay. And Elizabeth Lepofsky-Kennedy and Madeline D. Davis also reflected on the difficulty of finding interviewees among femmes who had, quote, gone straight. I would suggest that this issue occurs with particular frequency amongst people who experience attraction to or relationships with multiple genders, because it's relatively easier for them to engage in different gendered relationships, to not take part in bisexual or LGBTQ groups, and to therefore become difficult to distinguish from the straight majority. This leads me to my third point, that of language. Queer history, including queer oral history, generally seeks to move away from a focus on identity labels, such as bisexual, lesbian, gay, and so on. In some ways, this approach helps to deal with some of the issues I've just discussed. So interviewees Louise and Curtis, who spoke about the lack of bisexual community, identified as bisexual at the time of our interviews, but previously identified as a lesbian and a gay man. Given the lack of bisexual community they discussed, it's easy to see how some people who experienced attraction to more than one gender might choose not to identify themselves as bisexual at all, even today. Again, I think those life histories, experiences, and relationships of people for whom that's the case can still inform us about sexuality and community in 1970s and 1980s Britain and today. And so I think their stories are still worth telling in kind of a broader bisexual history. For that reason, I've included the term multiple gender attraction in my recruitment materials of interviewees and my analysis. At the same time, there are some problems with doing so that I have to acknowledge. So firstly, the term multiple gender attraction was one of my own making. I've heard other speakers in the conference today talk about plurisexual, non-monosexual, kind of multisexual. There's lots of different terms. I came up with multiple gender attraction because I thought it had the kind of least baggage, because it was something that I'd come up with completely myself. I wanted to emphasize potential attraction rather than identity or relationships, and to move beyond the gender binary by emphasizing multiple rather than two. However, the term is not exactly catchy, and it confused quite a lot of my interviewees. Another issue is that the stigma which makes some individuals unwilling to identify themselves as bisexual also means that others are, very understandably, keen to defend it against perceived undermining or delegitimization. While I want to include people who don't identify as bisexual, I also don't want to alienate those who do or cast aspersions on their identity. And this kind of dilemma can be seen in the quote from Curtis on the slide. When I mentioned to him that I was particularly keen to find and interview people who did not identify as bisexual, and he seemed confused and asked, surely they had some sexual orientation that was bisexual. I mentioned that dilemma, because I think it's an issue with queer oral history that needs to be recognised. But at the same time, I still don't have any clear answers. Although queer oral historians might face similar responses from interviewees who identify as gay or lesbian and who don't support the move away from identity labels, I again think that the issue is particularly resonant in the case of bisexuality, because it is a newer, less established identity label, and bisexuals are therefore more likely to be sensitive to perceived attempts to delegitimize it, again, understandably. Ultimately, I decided to describe my work as a history of bisexuality and multiple gender attraction, to kind of try and cover all of the bases. But I'm still not sure about whether that's potentially the worst of both worlds. And I think that despite the lack of resolution there, conducting an oral history has been really helpful in forcing me to contend with some of the problems in queer theory that I was previously able to ignore or kind of brush past. I want to conclude by restating the importance for queer oral history of contending with both bisexuality as an identity and multiple gender attraction as a capacity for sexual or romantic attraction. I believe that they add to and further complicate debates about appearance, visibility, and passing, as well as notions of community and how the boundaries of that community can be recognized in language. And I also want to emphasize the importance of queer oral history and of oral history that's appropriately reflexive and self-critical. Queer oral history provides a unique opportunity to relate the ideas of queer theory, which can sometimes be overly abstract, to the practical methodological issues of recruiting interviewees and conducting interviews. And I think that for all oral historians and bisexuality researchers, it's invaluable to keep questioning and exploring our own assumptions, identities, and yes, even hairstyles, in order to give readers a fuller understanding of the histories that we're conducting and the important political and historical purposes they can serve. Thank you.
Loving men and women, or the monosexual heteronormative explanations of bisexuality in sex education books in Germany. Hello to everyone. In this contribution, I like to investigate the bi plus sexual representation and explanation in German sex education books. The focus is set after reunification in 1990 to the present day. There is a huge market for sexual education books that fits outside the curriculum in formal school education and sex educational projects by governmental institutions like the Health Ministry. I will not include the sex education books by Christian fundamentalists who had an enormous list of publications in the mid-2000s. I will translate the citations. The word Geschlecht will mostly be translated to sex, as the term gender just got popular in recent years and is mostly used as this word in German. In the sample period, at least 230 distinct books about sex education for teens or preteens were published, not including new unchanged editions. The majority are German books, but there are also translations of sex ed books, mostly from the English language or Scandinavia. I chose to have a closer look at some of these books. According to Jonathan Zimmerman in Too Hot to Handle, the big four taboos of sex education are abortion, contraception, masturbation, and homosexuality. This meant, in context for Germany, that schools were obliged to prevent students from gender and sexual identities other than heteronormative and cisnormative ones until the year 2002. This was said for the context of sex education in school, not concerning the free book market. How did and does the book market handle the topic of bisexuality? There is a slight possibility of periodization of the appearance of bisexuality in these books. The first phase reaches up to around 2018. More and more bisexuality gets recognized as its own orientation/identity that is not just a phase of puberty. Until that point, there was a great emphasis on bisexuality as just a phase of puberty. Quote, the classic psychoanalysis assumes a so-called principal bisexuality that lasts for the end of puberty, end quote. In other examples, the books by Trude Ausfelder are notorious hostile towards bisexuality when trying to explain bisexuality. In her books, she emphasizes bisexuality as a phase and that a bisexual person needs openly or secretly another partner for their homosexual activities. Quote, "Nobody talks about it. Many live on the outside a bourgeois life with a family, and in secret they take part in their homosexual activities. Others are committed to it and their partner accepts it. Most times it is just a tendency to try it with the same sex. In this case, it's no real bisexuality. Especially women like to try the homosexual variant. Heterosexual men, in contrast, see their masculinity damaged by a homosexual adventure." End quote. The constant of bisexuality in these books is the narrow definition of bisexuality. The short summary is the love or attraction to men and women. Newer books explicitly say about it, quote, "For you, there exists the gender man and woman, and you like both of them," end quote. The other example is, quote, "You feel attracted towards men as to women, then you are with a great probability bisexual," end quote. This must be set in the contrast to the definition of pansexuality according to this book. Quote, "Pansexuality is the extension of bisexuality because it does not only include men and women, but other gender like non-binary people as a potential partner," end quote. So both examples are out of recent books. The first was published in 2019, the other in 2020, yet both narrow bisexuality down to a binary attraction to men and women. The book FAQU goes even so far as to exclude binary trans persons as potential partners for bisexual people. In a very similar way, bisexual people always must feel equally attracted to men and women, and their action commutes constantly between them. Quote, "Some people commute their whole life between both sexes," end quote. Or in a sex ed lexicon, quote, "Anyone who is attracted equally to men as towards women and has sexual relationship with both is bisexual," end quote. There is one consistency over the years. Bisexuality is treated in a form of othering. In nearly all texts, it is at par with homosexuality. It is a form of gay or lesbian light. The chapters about homosexuality are separated from the chapters about love, relationship, and first sex. Most of the times bisexuality gets mentioned, but the chapters focus exclusively on being gay or lesbian. They treat bisexuality as if it is the same. In the book, "So wild nach deinem Erdbeermund," bisexuality is literally just a footnote in the chapter about homosexuality. Quote, "If girls and boys are attracted to partners of both sexes," end quote. Heterosexuality is the norm. There is no chance to get information about how first-time sex between two people is who are not a cis woman and a cis man. There is a non-existing of specific bi-plus sexual themes and explanations. It is to assume that all authors write from a heteronormative perspective. One positive example is in the book Unten drum herumreden by Hannah Witten, that she gives room for queer people to talk about their identity. There is also a bisexual voice with Aliana Fender, yet also this book is not perfect. Quote, "Bisexual, you feel attracted to both sexes' gender," end quote. And Fender says in contrast in the second sentence, quote, "As a woman who feels attracted to men, women, and all in between, I call myself bisexual," end quote. And later, quote, "Because my definition of bisexuality includes an attraction towards my own as to other genders," end quote. This example values the importance of bi-plus voices in sex education. To conclude, there is nearly no development in the explanation of bisexuality during the last 30 years, which is difficult for historical analysis. Bisexuality is stuck into a binarism. Only in recent years, bi-plus sexualities are depicted as their own, but experience othering to a cis heterosexual norm. Still, bisexuality is explained as an attraction that is split perfectly in half between women and men. There must be always an equal attraction to those genders. Books that should teach also about bi-plus-sexualities are full of bi-hostility and disencouragement. Nearly all authors of sex education books in Germany accepted the liberalization of youth sexuality in a heterosexual context, according to Susanne Achterberg. Queer sexuality, and in this case bisexuality, is not part of the liberalization because bisexuals' own voices are nearly absent, so that bisexuality was and still is framed and defined by non-bi plus people. Thank you for your attention. Do you have any questions?
I'm going to give a brief presentation on my queer history dissertation, and I am in the early stages of this research / I'm halfway through. So in terms of my own background, I have a background in criminal psychology, and specifically I'm interested in the issue of memory. So I have a PhD in psychology, and I've always wondered sort of how people remember the past. And so history and queer history for me, and the conversations we had earlier around oral history and how interviewers, or the person collecting the evidence, if you will, about what happened in history, I've been really interested in how that affects how history is told. And so as sort of the collective memory that is queer history and how it changes and who writes it, I think is a fascinating topic. So I'm really interested in bi history from that perspective. And I think it's really important to know your history. So in the sense that I think as bisexuals, it feels like there is no bi history, and that's incorrect. Bisexual people have been part of queer history since the beginning. We didn't always call ourselves bisexual, but often we did. And the mother of pride often is said, Brenda Howard, who was one of the key people involved in organizing the Pride events after Stonewall or Christopher Street Day parades, that was a bisexual woman, for example. So there's lots of bi people in history, and I think it's worth celebrating that. And I think tethering ourselves to our history, it feels really good to feel like there's a continuity with the past. And just like there is, I think, a real revolution in history when lesbian people and gay men started finding themselves in the history books, and sometimes in sort of not obvious ways. I think that was a really big moment for a lot of people to be like, hey, we've always existed. And hey, there's people who have had the kinds of desires and oppression and attraction and the good and the bad that comes with that for a very long time. And so I think it's as important for bisexuality. But if we're talking about who writes that history, I think sometimes we turn to the bisexual community. So my research is on an archive, which is recently digitized, of the magazine that was published by the bisexual community for the bisexual community, a magazine called Anything That Moves. And it was published from actually 1990 to 2000, which is a really interesting time period, I think, because if we're sort of latching on to some of the things that we've already heard about in terms of some of the turmoil and the exclusionary practices that we're seeing within some LGBT plus organizations, and bisexual people sometimes feeling and being sort of pushed out of these spaces, then the sort of emergence of bi communities, this is quite fresh. So 1990, we're only a little while into that sort of, the bi community sort of breaking out a bit and saying, hey, we need our own things, we need our own space, we need our own dialogue. And this is a prime example of that. So Anything That Moves, it's an archive that I would encourage anyone who's interested in bi history to look at. It's online. It's a passion project. So a couple of people just decided they wanted to scan every single copy, and there's about 2 a year. And it's a nice sort of continuous archive of things that you can monitor change. And so that's what I'm interested in. I'm interested in change in what this magazine published by and for the bi community, what the issues are that were considered important and how they change over that period. And so I'm exploring the fears, hopes, and identity of the bi plus community in this turbulent period between 1991 and 2001 in San Francisco. So this was specifically published in the San Francisco area at the time, although it became more international over time because of the internet. And that's one of the things that I think is really, really interesting about this archive, is it spans the two sides of the internet. So 1991 to 2001 is of importance because it's only shortly after the very first BIPOC organizations were founded. The first BIPOC conferences took place, and because of massive shifts in LGBT plus community structures that were taking place during this time due to the emergence of the internet. And so in some ways, a lot of bi communities are actually, if you will, digital natives, in that a lot of bi communities only ever existed online, and the emergence of the internet resulted in the emergence of bi spaces that I think will be historically interesting, are already historically interesting, I argue, but will certainly become even more so as time progresses. So the internet emerged, in case you're not totally familiar with this, 1995 is when the internet sort of emerged in the way that we recognize it now. And so that's smack in the middle of this archive. And you can see huge changes in the dialogue and community and where things are held from the early editions to the later ones. The Bay Area in California is also really interesting because it's a hub where this technological shift is both digital and physical, in that it resulted in massive shifts in neighborhoods. So simultaneously, there's this massive pull of San Francisco as a gay hub, as a queer hub. And so there's a lot of migration of queer people to the Bay Area and to San Francisco specifically. But then at the same time, gentrification means that people are getting pushed out. And so you're getting a very specific representation of queer people in San Francisco at this period. Side note, I'm Canadian, I'm not from San Francisco. I know that my accent sounds like I might be from there. I am not. So this is me as an outsider exploring this community in the past. But yeah, I think that this sort of change in the sort of physical and social structure of this area, it makes it a really interesting place. And so it's lucky that this archive exists that chronicles what people in this particular place thought. In terms of the source, there's 22 editions, so approximately two per year of the magazine Anything That Moves. And again, it was written, edited, and self-published by the bi community. As far as I can understand, it looks like it was basically run by volunteers, and the costs of the publishing were covered by subscription. So people could buy an issue, but they weren't very expensive, and all the money went to printing costs, really. And each of these newly digitized editions consists of images and written content. They're quite big. So each of these magazines has about 20 to 30 pages, and which is great. It's an absolute treasure trove of bi information. And if you're interested in things like bi art, there's so much art by artists, and I think that could be really mined as well. There's poetry, there's book reviews, there's classifieds, there's ads. I mean, if you're interested in the history in that time period of any of these things, this is a really good resource that's out there. The main questions that I'm interested in, though, are in this magazine, Anything That Moves, published by bisexuals for bisexuals, did the discourse around bisexuality change? And then what were the contextual factors that influenced the discussions around bisexuality in this magazine? Here's an example. So in 1991, we can see in the early editions of this magazine, we see quite a lot of discussion about AIDS. And that is completely unsurprising because that is right in the middle of really heated and horrific conversations about the AIDS epidemic. And so this is a very, very big topic. And there's a lot of conversation about how people who are bisexual are affected by AIDS and the AIDS epidemic, but also how bisexual people can be allies to people who have AIDS. So you can see a lot of this rhetoric, and health specifically, this aspect of health. At the beginning, it's much more sort of physical health, whereas later on it develops more into a mental health question. And so I think again, seeing this within the context of what's happening historically at the time, I think is really important, and it shows why sort of some of these conversations change. From the beginning, I was really happy to see that bi spaces, and this is something we hear a lot, is that bi spaces from the beginning are often working quite hard to be intersectional and inclusive. And whether they succeed is a completely different matter. However, I like that there is a focus from the very first issue on intersectionality. So there's specifically a section for the Bisexual People of Color Caucus. There's specifically there's articles on genocide and Native American Indians. Again, we're in the United States, so of course that is a local issue of importance. And so there's at least an attempt to create an inclusive space and an intersectional space, which I think that makes me very happy as a bisexual person to see that our community has tried, at least, and been conscious of privilege and conscious of intersectionality, as have lots of other queer people. It's not just bisexual people, of course, but it's nice to see it in our community specifically. So it's not a new thing, is also what I'm trying to say. This has been something we've been working on for a very long time. In 1996, globalization starts to become a big issue. So before that, it's very local. And I think this is probably mirrored around the world, is that you have sort of a very local focus. But then the internet happens, and suddenly you can connect with bisexual people around the world. And why not? I mean, this very conference is happening because there are bisexual people around the world who have access to the internet, who can all talk to each other. And it creates a completely different kind of space. And so in 1986, they have a whole section. So you can even see that the organization of the magazine changes. And they have an international section which just speaks to different aspects of globalization. And one thing that specifically becomes an issue is, of course, cyber. So there's a lot of talk about cyber and the internet. 1986, you get the first actual mention of it. And then you get fears about the internet. So the cyber piece, I think, is interesting in that initially, there's no mention of it because it doesn't exist. Then there's very exciting globalization. We're going to reach the world. Let's connect all the people around the world. And then by the end, it gets discontinued, probably because of the internet. And so this magazine, it sort of gets killed because it doesn't become as important, or it doesn't become as relevant for preserving queer spaces internationally. And I think that's a good thing and a bad thing. I think it's probably quite sad when you see a magazine, like your own magazine, if you're publishing it, sort of stop going and being in publication, in circulation. But on the other hand, maybe it's nice that there's now a plethora of other places that people can go and it's no longer needed. So I think that there's, and I have mixed feelings about the internet and this magazine, but I think it'll be interesting to see further how it's impacted discourses about bisexuality. In 2000, we also see, related to fears around the internet killing this particular magazine, there's also concerns about the pink pound. And if you've been to any Pride marches recently, you'll have heard the saying, "Pride is not for profit." I remember recently walking down, it's just "Pride is not for profit" is a really big thing that we're still saying, 21 years later. And the pink pound specifically, and how there's sort of a rainbow washing and a co-opting of bisexuality and queer issues by corporates was also something that only towards the end became something that they were concerned about within this particular magazine, at least. And I'm looking forward to exploring that a bit more as well. And that's me. So all I wanted to do is to say, hey, this archive exists, and I think it's really interesting to look at changes in discourses over time and the historical factors that influence them.